Good evening, everybody. Welcome to History Author Talks. It's always great to see a lot of my regulars, and I appreciate everyone signing on tonight. I think we have a great program. Before we start, just a few announcements. As you all know, I'm involved in a myriad of what my family likes to call my history stuff. We're in our busy season here, and we've had literally a few thousand school children come to Washington Crossing Historic Park just the last few weeks. So it's been a very busy time, but of course I love it. I love being with the kids. I've also done a number of full-day tours of the 10 Crucial Days historic area. And we have our musical, The Crossing, which is in development. We are going to be doing a presentation of selections from The Crossing at Princeton Battlefield. So we're starting rehearsals for that. So it's very exciting. So it's been a very busy time. So just wanted to let you all know what we're doing. As a reminder, for our guest this evening, as always, if you have questions for our guest, you'll use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen if you have questions. And also, those questions will be coming to me. So hopefully we'll be able to get to those questions. So tonight, well, normally we talk about military history on these programs. As you know, battles may be very sexy, but today we're going to be learning about battles of another sort. Battles of economics and philosophies and politics. In prior programs, we discussed strategy and tactics with the sword, the musket, and the cannon. The battles outlined by our guests tonight are no less dramatic and bloody. The weapons are rhetoric and will. And these battles were not against the redcoats and the dreaded Hessians. These were the Civil War of words. Tonight, we have Eli Merritt. Eli is a political historian at Vanderbilt University who specializes in the founding era of the United States with the intersection of demagogues and democracy. He's written for the American Journal of Legal History, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and the Chicago Tribune. Among other publications. He's the editor of How to Save Democracy, as inspiration and advice from 95 world leaders. And he also writes an online newsletter called The American Commonwealth that explores the origins of the United States political discontents and solutions to them. So with that, I am very pleased to introduce everybody to our guest this evening. Welcome, Eli Merritt.
Great to be with you, Roger. I've respected you for a long time, and I'll say why I am a fan of the Sons of the American Revolution. It's because the society stands behind the Constitution and the concept of e pluribus unum. If I'm not mistaken, that's in your charter, things like that. So thank you all for what you do.
Well, I appreciate that. We have a lot of members of my compatriots of the Sons of the American Revolution. We also have members of the Daughters of the American Revolution. We have a number of my friends from the Congress of the American Revolutionary War roundtables who join us on these programs, plus other just general history geeks. We're all history geeks here, and we certainly learn a lot from books like yours. And I have to say to everyone, I came across Eli's book in my day job. As many of you know, I'm a literary agent, and I also publish some books. And this came across my desk from the publisher and sounded fascinating. Disunion Among Ourselves, the Perilous Politics of the American Revolution. Well, you got me there. And I was telling Eli before we got on the program this evening, I got the book in the mail just a couple of weeks ago, and I've been so busy with all my public history work, I wasn't, I've only made it about halfway through. And the only reason why I've only made it about halfway through is because I'm reading every word. It's fascinating and should be on everyone's bookshelf. So Eli, I know that you have a presentation. Why don't you, we'd love to hear what you have to say, and then I'm sure I know I have some questions, and I bet we're going to have some questions from the audience as well.
All right, well, I'll start right in. Let me see if I can. Do we see the book cover?
We do indeed. We're doing good. Yep.
Wonderful. Let's see. I'm going to start off tonight by telling you why the founders of the United States perpetuated slavery. And because, of course, this is history, we know that there's not one reason why the founders perpetuated slavery, but there's many reasons. But I'm going to discuss three explanatory models or historiographical lenses through which we can view this event in our history. And two of them will be familiar to you. I think the third will be less familiar to you. And the third, called the survivalist interpretation, is really the through line of my book. It is discussed in depth in the introduction of the book, and then it is the core theme that covers the full 360 pages or so. So the first explanatory model for why the founders perpetuated slavery is one that we could call sort of a racist model of interpretation, or to use a buzzword from today that's very significant, the white supremacist model. And that model, there's complexities within it, of course, but it just states, I think, the real truth, that they lived at a time where they felt like Africans brought from across the water, or African Americans in the country, were intellectually and socially inferior. So there was a sense of a hierarchy or caste system, and African Americans were at the bottom of that hierarchy. The other explanatory model we can consider to be the economic model, which I know everyone's familiar with, and that is that the Southern colonies' entire economies were based upon slavery and slave labor. But not only that, we also know that Northern commerce was dependent also on merchant ships and the traffic in slaves, and the triangular trade and other types of trade that depended on that. So those are two models I think you're familiar with. I'll spend a little more time on this, which I introduced in the introduction, is called the survivalist interpretation. And that is that the founders perpetuated slavery because they were trapped. There was really no way out of this situation, and here's why. If it had happened that one or more of the northern states put their foot down at some point during the American Revolution or thereafter and said, we are simply not going to form a long-term union unless we as a unity of 13 states agree to abolish the slave trade or to enact some sort of plan for emancipation, even a slow plan for emancipation, what would have happened next? One or more of the southern states would have seceded from the Union. They would not have tolerated that infringement upon their rights, their sovereignty, and their definitions of property. And what would have happened next? The next thing would happen is other southern colonies would probably have seceded as well, and they would have formed a Southern Confederacy. And this sounds pretty bad. Disunion would have happened. This is for sure. In my reading of the history, disunion would have happened. And that, again, that sounds bad enough, but that's really not the gist of what's so important. In fact, many of the founders of the country really felt the most natural outcome after the 13 had won the Revolutionary War together. The most natural outcome would have been, in fact, for the 13 states to divide into separate confederacies, either 3 confederacies or 2, New England, Middle, and Southern, or Northern and Southern. Here's the problem, though. They would have fallen into civil wars. That is what they were so certain of. There was not going to be a peaceful way to divide into separate confederacies because they had so much to be in conflict about, and I'll name some of those things. The most important is land, but others were their finances within the Continental Congress were a mess. Every state accused other states of not having given enough to the war effort. And that's one aspect of the finances. Then, of course, there was massive war debt to France, mainly to France, but also to Spain. And how would they have divided that? How would they have managed the undivided debt that helped us to fight the Revolutionary War. The last and most important was they would have certainly had wars over land, many trouble spot areas within the 13 colonies. But as you all know, after the Treaty of Paris ending the Revolutionary War, we doubled the size of the country by inheriting the Trans-Appalachian West, extending from the Appalachian Mountains all the way to the Mississippi River. And no one owned that. Many of the states claimed it, and they had conflicting claims. And now I'll draw your attention, hopefully you can see this on the slide. I'll draw your attention to these conflicting claims. So here you can see, even on the map, which is often the case, they would have had to, rather than solve the problems of land claims in the Trans-Appalachian West through a judicial system, court system, they were convinced that they would have fallen into civil war. So in the book, I call this a shotgun wedding. And I say that the founders ended up perpetuating slavery because in some ways it was a devil's bargain. In a way, the idea they had is they would not survive, the white Americans would not survive if they all didn't subscribe to a policy of not interfering with slavery. So that's the devil's bargain. And the shotgun wedding, I hope you understand, this is the dominant theme throughout the entire book, that all along the founders had to make compromises within the Congress because they felt outside of them, there were the guns of civil war saying if if even one of the colonies or states pulled out of the Union, it would lead to a cascading problem of separate confederacies leading to civil war. So maybe we'll talk about that some in our period of questions and answers. But now I'll go on. Roger's going to tell me when I have 2 or 3 more minutes. We're trying to keep my presentation to 20 or 25 minutes.
Yeah.
What I'd like to do now is tell you a couple of other stories from the book, and also read you some quotations from the book. My book, in some ways, it's a radical proposition that the #1 reason that this union was formed back in the 1770s and perpetuated, it was formed to prevent us from killing one another in civil wars. That is the radical, but in my view, absolutely correct central thesis of my book. So I'll tell you a couple of stories now that further that. One in a way is why the founders perpetuated slavery. Another, and I'll share with you now, is why the Congress in 1775 elected George Washington as the commander-in-chief. There were 2 reasons for this, and the one is best known to us, is that he was a man of absolutely tremendous character and virtue, and had a presence that was awe-inspiring, and courage on the battlefield was unequaled. And that's one reason. But the other very significant reason, without which he would not have become commander-in-chief and ongoing throughout become the first president of the United States, is that he was both Southern and he hailed from the state of Virginia. Virginia was in the vanguard of the Southern states. The expectation and hope was where Virginia went, the other Southern colonies would go as well. And so one of the primary reasons George Washington became commander-in-chief was to unite the Northern and Southern states in the Union, and to unite the Northern and Southern states in the Army. But that's not the only reason. I'm going to tell you something I find to be absolutely awesome. The other reason they needed George Washington to be the commander-in-chief is they were afraid if the commander-in-chief was Northern, most specifically was from New England, after the American Revolution, we might have a civil war. And here's how that was going to go. And then I'll read you a couple of quotations to back this up. The fear of many of the delegates and individuals from the middle colonies and from the southern colonies was that New England would dominantly form the army. And if we had a dominant army under a New England commander, they would feel so much bloodlust after the American Revolution that they would probably first and foremost, they would invade the state of New York in order to take control of the Hudson River. It was well known at that time that New England really wanted to have a water border of the ocean. On its east and on its west, it wanted to have the Hudson River. And so there was great fear that a civil war would break out at the Hudson River. And what they never understood is what would happen next. What states would ally with what states? And there were predictions, many of them, that New England, a hardy and brave and strong people, would at some point make a conquest across all the southern states, imposing their Puritan religions and belief systems. So let me open up here to a couple of quotations. So this is from John Adams. He said the decision to elect George Washington was not made inside the halls of the Continental Congress. It was made through negotiation out of doors. Adams further said that Washington was the product of a Southern party against a Northern, and a jealousy against a New England army under the command of a New England general. Important for me to back this up because this history is not too well known. So some of you might have heard of Eliphalet Dyer, who was from Connecticut, really another outstanding general. And in many ways, he was disappointed he did not get the election himself. So he felt it necessary in a series of letters to write back home to Connecticut to explain why George Washington, instead of him, became commander-in-chief. In one letter, he said, and this is a quote, "It is to remove all jealousies more firmly, it removes all jealousies, more firmly cements the Southern to the Northern, and takes away the fear of the former, lest an enterprising Eastern New England general, proving successful, might with his victorious army give law to the Southern gentry and the Western gentry." One more letter that Dyer wrote said this: "His appointment will tend to keep up the Union and more strongly cement the Southern with the Northern colonies, and serve to removing all jealousies that an army composed principally of New Englanders, if happily they prove successful," he means in the War of Independence, "of being thereafter formidable to the Southern colonies." So with that, I'll move on to sort of the second area of story I want to share with you, and that is how we got the Declaration of Independence, why it happened, and somewhat when it happened. And I'll do that simply by means of telling you, kind of narrating the history, but introducing perhaps some elements of that are less familiar. June 7, 1776, as I think most people here know, Richard Henry Lee stood up in front of the Continental Congress and said, read a resolution by Virginia, basically saying it's time now. We finally arrived at the moment when it's time to move on three things: a Declaration of Independence or a resolution for independence, and a constitution uniting us, and foreign alliances. Most notably, they were thinking of France. He makes this announcement. June 8th is the first day of debates about these issues, and specifically independence. And they immediately deadlock. And not only that, we find, according to the notes of Thomas Jefferson, that a handful, we don't know the exact number, of middle colony delegates and South Carolina delegates essentially said, "Don't bully us. We will secede from this Congress if you force our hand and drive us into independence against our will." So here we go here. Give me a second to turn the page. This is Thomas Jefferson's note about June 8th, that if such a declaration should now be agreed to, these delegates, referring to Middle and South Carolina delegates, must now retire, and possibly their colonies might secede from the Union, that such a secession would weaken us more than could be compensated by any foreign alliance. And so now we have to stop and pause. There were many causes of resistance amongst the faction that we know as the Reconciliationists. And many of them are known. They were scared of imperial civil war against Great Britain, with good reason. It had the most formidable military and navy in the world. And there were other reasons as well, but one of them also was they were very fearful. This is a dominant theme throughout the entire book and Revolutionary period. There was great fear of the dominance of the New England colonies because they were strong, they were united, they were tough, and they had the capacity to create ships and merchant ships, and most importantly, a navy on their own. So there was great fear of New England. So here is an example from Edward Rutledge of South Carolina, something he wrote in the month of June 1776 to explain his resistance to a Declaration of Independence and forming a government with New England. The things he worried most about were the possibility of a civil war with New England, and the other was just simply having the New England dominate the government and form a tyranny of New England. And he bragged that he wasn't really worried about being defeated. He was a big ego, Rutledge. He wasn't really worried about being defeated in a war by New England, but he was worried about their characters. So he wrote, and this is a quote: "The force of their arms I hold exceedingly cheap, but I confess I dread their overruling influence in council. I dread their low cunning and those leveling principles which men without character and without fortune in general possess, which are so captivating to the lower class of man." So I'm going to just drop back for a minute to June 8th and tell you on June 9th, these debates were hot. This secession threat happened, and they decided, all right, we're going to postpone further debates on the Declaration of Independence or resolution on independence until July 1st. So when they came back on July 1st, this was the official day that they had set to cast their votes on a resolution for independence. And what happened? 9 states only voted in favor of independence. Pennsylvania and South Carolina voted no, against independence. Delaware's delegates split in half, so their vote was not counted. And New York simply didn't have instructions either way to vote, so it abstained. So here you have quite a serious dilemma on this vote. A supermajority had spoken, 9 for independence and 3 or 4 against. And there was no constitution at this time. There were informal rules of the House of the Continental Congress. They, for the most part, believed that a supermajority would be decisive in most all cases. But again, it wasn't formalized. But you had a situation here where Virginia and the New England colonies were going to declare independence. They were not going to wait any longer. They had waited enough, and that message was made sharp and clear to these 4 states that were not joining in on the vote. So what became very apparent is that the pro-independence states were going to move ahead with independence without, most importantly, let's think of this, the middle colonies. The middle colonies would secede, or maybe that may be too dramatic of a term. They would say, we need more time, let us think more about it. And the states that were pro-independence would declare independence. But then look at where, let me see if I have a slide here. Look at where, here's Washington. Let's see. I don't have that, but I'll leave up the Declaration of Independence here.
There you go.
I don't have, you can see how squeezed in the middle colonies are. The problem was going to be, how in the world were the southern colonies, the New England colonies, going to fight a war together without needing access to rivers and ships and supplies? They would need to forage in the middle colonies. So the larger point there is, there was going to be civil war in those colonies. They were squeezed in the middle of other colonies, which were absolutely determined at this point to declare their independence. So they were truly caught in a situation of a shotgun wedding with regard to the Declaration of Independence. You all know the expression join or die. This was the case for particularly these middle colonies. What would have happened to South Carolina if it had chosen not to go along, coerced in early July? It might have gone It might have gone with the British Empire. It might have sided with the Floridas and the British. That was much less problematic than what was going to happen with the middle colonies. So under incredible pressure on July 1st, recognizing that they must join or die, there was incredible overnight negotiation. We don't have a lot of notes about that, but what we do know is that on July 2nd, which is the date actually of the beginning of independence in our country, July 2nd, 1776, they rejoined, and under this pressure of shotgun wedding and join or die, 12 colonies voted in favor of independence. Essentially 13 did, because New York basically promised everyone, we are on board. We're going to go back and talk to our legislature, and we're going to make sure we're in this together. So that is how we got the Declaration of Independence. And I have a lot of quotes I could read, but I would like to read you just one. Thomas McKean of Delaware said later about the early days of July, unanimity in the 13 states, an all-important point on so great an occasion, was thus obtained. The dissension of a single state might have produced very dangerous consequences. And I hope in what we've talked about so far, that we understand what those very dangerous consequences were that he's referring to, which would be the splitting apart of the states, and therefore necessarily the states engaging in civil war with one another.
Eli,
yeah.
I think we're getting close here. So,
Okay, then let me move quickly. I'm going to summarize this just wonderful man here. Some of you might recognize him. I will be very quick. Charles Thompson, Secretary of the Continental Congress from 1774, the beginning until the end, 1789. And he wrote 3 letters to his wife. Her name was Hannah. This is now we're at the end of the revolution. This is 1783. And without going into any detail, I will tell you that was, as they had all predicted, one of the most painful domestic years of the war, because now the war was no longer the unifying force. They began to disband. Terrible arguments, conflicts over finances of the nation, the Western lands, and also where the capital would lie. And so, remarkably, Charles Thompson writes in a letter to his wife. I'll just read a little bit here. When I look forward, I see a dark cloud and gloomy prospects for America. I have much better quotes to read you, but we're short on time. And so what I'll say is he predicted that the nation wouldn't last. He looked at the future, and he thought that one of the confederations that was going to form in the country, for sure, was New England joined with New York. And I mentioned the Hudson River. That's why he explained New England was not going to rest unless it had the Hudson River. And that meant New York was going to either have to fight or join the New England Confederation. Another that he predicted, confederation, was Virginia by itself. I hope you can see the large claims of Virginia. It didn't get to keep all that land, of course, but it got to keep some of it. And then, because I know we're short on time, I'll tell you the other confederacy was going to be of the middle colonies, and they were going to form to try and spread out and get some of that land from Virginia that they don't believe that it warranted claiming. And then finally he said, I don't know what's going to happen with these southern colonies, because he said the wild card is South Carolina, and South Carolina is so much trouble. He said, for such is the fiery pride of South Carolina, such the dissipation of her morals and insolence occasioned by the multitude of slaves, that she will not cordially join in any union till she is taught by wisdom. Until she is taught wisdom by sore suffering. Wow. All right, thank you. I'm done, and I don't really mean this to be pessimistic. I know sometimes you're hearing it. I want you to please share with me if you're like, oh man, you're depressing me about my country. I want to hear about this is just the truth. And in the end, the founders held the country together in spite of this too. It's amazing. So thank you. Thank you for listening.
Well, that's great, Eli, and I appreciate that. It's not a matter of being pessimistic. I don't think it's, you're it's sort of the opposite view, the real view, as opposed to the musical 1776, which gives us, in a 2-hour musical, the easy view of how this all happened. I was the one the one thing that absolutely intrigued me in reading Disunion Among Ourselves was how this 11th hour backroom, what you call subterfuge, and maneuvering in the changing of the minds of the colonies that decided to say, well, yes, okay, we'll sign the Declaration of Independence. It happened in 24 hours. They changed their mind, which I thought was absolutely fascinating. You've done a great job in explaining how they really felt that, well, since New England was going to declare independence anyway, New England, New York were going to declare independence anyway, or Virginia rather, going to declare independence anyway, we better get on board. I mean, it sounds amazing that they changed in such a short period of time. Let's go back a little bit. Joseph Galloway, as early as 1774, I think was really explaining how this was all going to lead to civil war. And I thought it was very interesting how Galloway, as many may know, ends up in Philadelphia, ends up being the loyalist who felt that this country just wasn't going to last, and we had to remain loyal to the king. Was this the prevailing feeling among loyalists, that we just weren't going to last, and that was as opposed to being loyal to the king? We just didn't have the opportunity to be able to survive because we would break into civil war. You think that was a prevailing thought among loyalists?
I think for loyalists, that was one of many factors. Certainly, it was one of the factors. One thing I'll say about the loyalists is, and this is supported by Bernard Bailyn, who I think many of you have probably heard of, The Ordeal of Thomas Hutchinson and other books. We tend to discount the loyalist as in a black and white manner, which I think is very unhelpful. Oh, that person's a loyalist, therefore their viewpoints and attitudes are of no importance. I think we're reaching a point in the evolution of the historiography of the Revolution where we're kind of seeing them as people and wanting to understand better their viewpoints. So there was a time in which some of this type of evidence that I've described was they try to dismiss it. Well, that's just loyalist talk. They're just fear mongering to prevent us from uniting and succeeding in the revolution. That might be true if it was only from the loyalists, but it was from throughout. So I think the loyalists, of course, were deeply patriotic. They loved their country, and I will never discount that people did not want to fight a war and die and experience distress and dislocation in a war with Britain. But indeed, I do believe that would be a fantastic book or article if someone would look more deeply at this precise issue, as to what extent did folks turn into loyalists because they believed that the future of the 13 colonies and later states, even if they won the war with Britain, was one of endless bloodshed. So I have a section in my little notebook here, which is other quotes. I think it's worthwhile reading Galloway's speech, which he later turned into a book. This is from it. He predicts North-South Civil War. And this is from Joseph Galloway. The northern colonies, inured to military discipline and hardship, will in all probability be the first to enter the list of military controversy, and like the northern Saxons and Danes, carry devastation and havoc over the southern, who, weak for want of discipline and having a dangerous enemy within their bowels, meaning slaves, must after suffering all the horrors of a civil war yield to the superior force and submit to the will of the conquerors. So this is 1775. Someone is predicting, without describing the cause, that one day there will be a major North-South civil war here on this continent, and the North will defeat the South. And part of the reason that is they will enlist the help of the enemy within, which is slaves in the southern colonies. So history is just a fascinating, beautiful thing that anyone could state this. And then, of course, we lived through the Civil War. Complex, not entirely summed up there, but in some ways it was forecast in 1775.
So in a simplistic view, I mean, I think we get this sense that Congress spent, all the years of the American Revolution debating about how to supply Washington's army and trying to find some place where they wouldn't be captured by the British, running away from Philadelphia from time to time. But they really did spend a lot of time talking about a myriad of issues, which the delegates of the first Congress had to deliberate. I mean, everything from agroeconomy to embargoes to slavery, and of course, all of the logistics of dealing with Washington's army. What were some of these other issues that had to be debated and caused tension between the different states, Southern, Middle, and New England?
Well, I think the easiest way to think about that is all the major decisions they had to make together as a Congress of 13 states. All of them involved incredibly difficult debates and contentiousness and divisiveness and secession threats. We can start with the Continental Association, which they formed at the end of the first Continental Congress in 1774. If we had more time, I'd tell you in more detail about the actual secession from the Congress that took place by South Carolina. They walked out because they did not want an embargo on rice and indigo. They walked out and said, we're not going to sign this Continental Association because it's too disadvantageous to us. So under this threat of nullification and secession, the Congress had no choice but to compromise. That becomes a dominant theme in U.S. history that begins in 1774 and extends all the way to the end of the Civil War. This question, to what extent can states bully their way into getting policy change by saying they're going to nullify federal legislation and secede from the Union? So it began in 1774. So the Continental Association is one thing. We've talked about Washington's election as commander-in-chief, important event. We talked about the Declaration of Independence. Also critically important, vitally important. These conflicts were intense with secession threats of various kinds at various times, about the Articles of Confederation. That is in some ways one of the things I'm the most proud of in the book is no one has ever really told a good, honest story of our first Constitution. So that, and then the other thing I introduced that's had barely been touched on in US history was the terms that we were going to require as a union of 13 states in the peace treaty to end the American Revolution. And so starting in 1779, some of these things may be unfamiliar to folks, but they entered a 7-month intensive and acrimonious period of debate over what would be the conditions of the peace treaty. And the New England colonies said, well, let's get independence and we must have access to the Newfoundland fisheries, drawing rights on the Newfoundland fisheries, because that's our livelihood.
Well,
the state said, well, we feel kind of the same way, but not about fish. We feel the same way about making sure we get all of our Western lands in the peace treaty. And also, mainly Virginia and North Carolina demanded this, also access to the navigation of the Mississippi River. To geolocate everyone, Spain at that time had the Louisiana Purchase, and Spain had control of the mouth of the river. And so the Southerners were like, we just want all our Western lands plus navigation of the Mississippi River as conditions of peace. The Middle colonies said, what are you guys doing? It's enough for us to get independence. Let's not prolong this war for these extra items, which are actually not essential to all 13 of us. Terrible debates. In the end, I'll just fast forward and let you know, because of those critical North-South sectional debates and demands, They had actually been erased by the time that Adams and Ben Franklin and John Jay got to Paris to negotiate. But they fought and got all of those things in the peace treaty because they were worried if they didn't get one of them, there would be a sense of sensitivity among the South, for example, or New England.
Well, it was amazing leverage, and you know, for a military historian, I read, you know, a lot about the military history. While the Revolution was fought on the battlefields and with the privateers and the Royal Navy, I learned so much more about fisheries and navigation rights than I ever thought I would. And to see how critical it was in terms of holding everybody together. That New England had its issues about fishing off Newfoundland and dealing with the French, and the southern colonies with Mississippi, and it's absolutely fascinating to see, to put those pieces of the puzzle together. So to skip around a little bit, chapter 7, the Declaration, with the Declaration decided, some 30,000 British and Hessian soldiers were preparing to attack Washington and his army in New York, and the delegates now have to decide how and when to codify this, what you call the firm league of friendship. So why were the Articles of Confederation deficient? I mean, what is this is the original structure that they came up with. What wasn't going to work?
Well, I'll try to answer that, but in some ways, let me touch on first that the Article of Confederation, I mean, we spent time talking about the Declaration of Independence and how that in some ways was a shotgun wedding. They feared desperately. Again, you might say, why did we get the Declaration of Independence when we did? We discussed that. The Articles of Confederation, they felt, was absolutely necessary to unite them, because when we think about what the Articles of Confederation is, it is a way to achieve bloodless conflict resolution. And for all the reasons we've already discussed, they intensely feared the centrifugal forces of disunion. That's a dominant thing. The centrifugal forces of disunion in our country and the alliances we had early with one another, the various states, is a dominant force. The centrifugal forces of disunion were always there. And they worried quite critically that while they were fighting the War of Independence, that this was a force containing the centrifugal forces of disunion. But the great fear was, once the war was won, that force holding them together would not be able to overcome the countervailing centrifugal force of disunion. So that's why the Articles of Confederation was so important. But Benjamin Franklin proposed an Articles of Confederation in July of 1775. And they thought it was going to cause too much conflict to try and adopt one. So they put it off, they debated, they worried they could never create one constitution for all 13 states. And only in 1777 did they draft the Articles of Confederation. But what I want to remind everyone of is they fought for the next almost 4 years over the Articles of Confederation. They couldn't agree. Virginia refused to unite in the Articles of Confederation if their Western lands weren't guaranteed. Maryland ultimately held out the longest, saying it was never going to confederate if Virginia did not sacrifice some of its Western lands to the common treasury of the Continental Congress. So they finally adopted the Articles of Confederation only because they knew the war was about to end. It was in March of 1781, and they had the sense that the war was moving towards a successful conclusion. So to touch a bit on your question about the deficiencies, it was deficient because the 13 states wanted to maintain power in the states. They weren't just afraid of the Congress itself, but again, as we've alluded to, sectional powers within Congress that would become tyrannical. So the Articles of Confederation ended up being a weak document which gave too much power to the states. It wasn't just bad design, they could get nothing else but that. These states were refusing to replace one powerful central, possibly tyrannical government in the United States with what they had just were just fighting against in Britain. So I want to challenge anyone I speak to, never speak poorly of the Articles of Confederation. It was an amazing document. It was hard fought. It was much harder for them to achieve the Articles of Confederation than the US Constitution. Now, mind you, both were very difficult. Both were born out of absolute desperation that if we don't get to a constitution, we are soon going to disunite into separate confederacies. And if I haven't emphasized the point enough yet, that could have been fine. We could have been 3 countries. That's fine with me. I don't mind if we had 3 successful countries that were not warring with one another. But again, the central theme is civil war was foretold, and the separate confederacies were doomed to civil war. So the Articles of Confederation, we need to start talking of them as an amazing, amazing constitution rather than, oh, the deficient thing that they hastily threw together during the American Revolution.
So you're suggesting that the Articles of Confederation were a first draft, and because of the Articles of Confederation, we were able to see what wasn't going to work, and it allowed us as a basic structure to come up with the Constitution. Is that fair?
Well, that is true too. But I can tell you for certain that the Articles of Confederation were finally ratified by Maryland deciding to sign. Let's just call it a Monday. And by Tuesday, the delegates were already saying, we don't have any federal power. How are we going to coerce the states to do this? How are we going to achieve some system of taxation? So there was immediate worry that the Articles of Confederation were insufficient, but at least it was a constitution that was able to hold us together until around 1786, when actually, due to another North-South crisis that I've written about, is the Mississippi navigation crisis, the Continental Congress just fell apart, and they had decided, nope, these Articles of Confederation aren't going to do it. We're incompatible. We're either going to break apart or come up with some other solution. And that's why Hamilton, Madison, and others in Annapolis finally decided it's do or die. We have to get to a federal convention and get a new constitution, or it's over. We're going to separate into separate confederacies and let nature take its course.
So for the most part, we've been talking about the delegates in Congress and representatives from the different states. Not often mentioned in the top 10 list of what we call the founding fathers. You explain John Witherspoon and John Witherspoon and Tom Paine's theory of now. How the and how that how that translated to the common man.
I'm not certain how it translated to the common man, but I can answer that question. This is really interesting. Again, what we find with all of the archival material and common sense is if we read it through a lens not of inevitability of union, but with a sense of what were they worried about in terms of disunion. If anyone has common sense on your bookshelf, go have a look at it. Thomas Paine spends several pages saying that everyone is saying if we launch into independence, we are going to fall into disunion and civil wars. He was either convinced of another theory or used it as propaganda to achieve his great goal, which he wrote so beautifully about, was we must declare independence now. He said we have to do this now because we're young, and as 13 states, we will bond ourselves around this war, and that will be our bond. He says it more poetically than that, but the revolution is going to be our bond. And hasn't it been that for the past 250 years? But he also said, we got to do this now, because if we wait 30 or 40 years, these 13 states, colonies, or if they would be colonies then, will have grown bigger, and they will have grown more acrimonious with one another. There would be more animosity. And in the future, it will not be possible to unite us into one country. So that is where he said, we must do this now. And when he wrote it, he wrote all caps, we must do this now. And so John Witherspoon also said the same thing. And he, in some ways, also predicted a major civil war. He didn't say North and South, but he didn't just say we'll have civil wars. He said, I'm worried about a type of war that will follow the War of Independence that was just much worse than what we got in the War of Independence. So that's why now there was just some sense that Thomas Paine said, this is the seed time of continental union. So he really said the ground is fertile for union right now. And in some years, this will be impossible. We won't be able to unite, and there will have to be civil wars.
So we have a question here from Brooks Lyles, who's the historian general of the Sons of the American Revolution. How important were the personal relationships formed by military and political leaders during the almost 8 years of the war, eventually convincing them that we were better off together than we would be independently or in smaller European confederations?
Well, here's how I view that. Adding my survivalist interpretation of the American Revolution and the critical period and the survivalist interpretation begins in 1774. This theory, if we stayed together because we feared civil wars all the way until the Civil War actually happened. But the way I view that is their personal relationships were of the utmost importance, but also what were they talking about in these personal relationships? We know because there is abundant evidence behind the survivalist theory or survivalist model I have introduced that it is correct. But we also have to remember this, to talk about disunion and civil war, even then, was considered both frightening and somewhat taboo. It was even almost considered treasonous. So they avoided writing about it, and they avoided any sort of production of evidence that would reveal that this was their major concern. My belief is that in those personal relationships, in their private conversations, this is one of the most dominant topics. Look, wouldn't New England be much better off as a separate confederacy? They read Montesquieu. What did he say? Small republics, only small republics work. You cannot have these expansive republics. They fail. So I think it's the personal relationships plus the deep recognition that of the shotgun wedding theory, that they talked about that endlessly. I have plenty of evidence that they wrote about this. Of course, I don't have any evidence for what they talked about, but I think it's the personal relationships combined with the fact of the danger of disunion that ended up holding us together.
So as the war is going on, while all of this, while they're trying to determine how we were going to be one big happy family here, how did military setbacks affect the debate in Congress as it was evolving through the war?
It was very important. There was often blame of, as we all are, we stereotype others and we stereotype regions. After the failures of Washington's army in late 1776 and 1777 with the retreat across Long Island to New Jersey, my military history is not as strong as my political. There were recriminations. The Southern delegates were blaming the New England delegates. The New England delegates were blaming the Southern delegates or middle colony delegates. They broke it up in this way constantly. Like all of us, you have to think in stereotypes. And so, but there were people like John Adams. I've got to say, he's handed down to us in history as being sort of a bellicose, negotiator who offended people. And that could be true. But John Adams, I want to write more about John Adams, but John Adams said, look, guys, here's the truth. I can't believe my own New Englanders demonstrated cowardice on the battlefield. It was my people, I think, who demonstrated the cowardice. And he even joked he was thinking about moving to the South. He said, if it's true that New Englanders were, did he use the word poltroons? I think he did, on the battlefield, then he wanted to move to the Southern colonies. So, and later too, I'll just say that the Southern states, were in a terrible situation in 1780 and 1781. And they felt neglected by not only the Northern colonies, but George Washington himself. And there was much discussion and complaint about how can this be possible with the northern states are, we, in their hour of need, we put forth men, we win and we fought, and now they are abandoning us. At that point, there was fear that we'd get a peace treaty, and that likely the outcome would be that in order to get a peace treaty, the 13 colonies were going to have to give up South Carolina and Georgia. Imagine that. Could have been independence for 11 of us, but not for 2 of us. I argue, and I'm not the only one who's argued exactly this, but I do it in much greater depth, that George Washington caught wind of this. I know he got letters saying, look, there's trouble in the South. You better pay some attention to them, or we may have a disaffection of some of the Southern colonies or Southern states. So that's one reason George Washington sent troops south, and then actually by good fortune discovered the great bonanza of conquest that he could at Yorktown. So the answer to that is there was constant interaction between what was happening on the battlefield, particularly when there were defeats, of course, because human beings, what happens when there's a big disappointment? We look around the room, whether it's in politics or at our spouse, and blame the other person.
That's great.
I would like, if anyone has questions about what I said at the beginning, about why the founders perpetuated slavery, I just wanted to put out there. I would love to hear any questions you have about that, because in some ways, of course, that's the most sensitive topic politically, that I think I handled it quite well in the book. But and I just wanted to throw that out there. If anyone has questions about that, please don't hesitate to ask.
We did not actually get any questions from anyone in the audience, but I would certainly want to follow it up, because obviously this is, as you say, this is a topic of great controversy, certainly with the 1619 project and what has been written about our founding. I think the question that I would have for you would be, how would you, given the topic of slavery, how would you define presentism?
Well, of course, presentism is the notion that somehow or another we have ideologies or biases and prejudices within our mind based on our contemporary experience, and that we then go back and we interpret the past through our current biases or prejudices. So yes, this is a complaint, of course, that's made that we are expecting, or many people are expecting, the founders of the United States, those at the period of the Revolution, to have all the benefits of the evolution of liberal democracy over the past almost 250 years. That has enabled us to more deeply understand and appreciate the truth of all men are created equal. And as we alluded to earlier, that African Americans are not socially or intellectually inferior. So presentism, I think, leads us to many people, at least, to look back and to judge the individuals in the past through the lens of the benefits and greater enlightenment about something, especially something like race, that exists today. And I think the most important thing that I would like to argue as I'm talking about this book in the coming weeks is really the importance of additive history. Additive history. Now, not all history is additive. Some of it is just, it's not correct. But additive history instead of revisionist history. And that's why when I was discussing this, I said, there's more than 3 models, but I said there's a racism model, there's an economic model, and then there's a survivalist model for understanding the founding period. I think they're all true. But that's one of the great benefits of history. If we will allow history, deep history and complex history, to enter into us, I think it's one of the most, the greatest medicines for our soul and greatest medicines for our nation that exist. Because if we can transcend or work through the cognitive dissonance that it requires within us to accept, let's just say, 3 models of why the founders perpetuated slavery, it causes us to mature. We become more mature. We become less tribal. So I think that history really should probably trump math and reading. The 3 R's, I think we need to say, there are 3 R's and an H. We need to study history, and not superficial history, but deep history, And sadly, we see in the paper all the time, of course, that folks are engaging in history wars instead of history conversations based upon additive history and the idea of deep history and the way that history can heal us if we will allow it in.
Well, the bell has rung, and I am thrilled, Eli, that you're actually going to be joining us here in Princeton on June 12th, for where we will continue this history conversation, and we'll have an opportunity to see you in person to keep the conversation going. I want to encourage everybody to go to historyauthortalks.com and click on the bookshop, where you can purchase a copy of Disunion Among Ourselves, with Eli's book, or wherever books are sold, wherever you buy your books. If you buy from History Author Talks, a portion of the proceeds goes to the SAR library. But I promise you, you're going to learn a lot of very newsworthy information that you may not have seen in other books on the American Revolution. So I want to thank Eli for joining us this evening. You'll be able to get in touch with Eli at his website. That's Eli Merritt, ELIMERRITT.com. And he will, you can contact him there, or you can just get in touch with me, and I can connect you with Eli. Eli, I want to thank you.
I'll share my email address. I like to say at this point, if anyone can feel free to share, since these virtual meetings are so easy, if anyone or people want to gather 5 or more people to have a conversation, or I would have a presentation similar to the one I've done today, you can reach out. My email address is eli.merritt@vanderbilt.edu. Again, eli.merritt@vanderbilt.edu. So I'd enjoy to hear from anyone, or if you have more feedback about the book or any of the historical models we've discussed today. So sorry to interrupt you, Roger. Thank you.
Not a problem. I just put your email address in the chat for everyone. So I appreciate everyone. I appreciate your coming, Eli, giving us your hour. And as always, everyone, remember that you can go to historyauthortalks.com to the past programs tab. We've taped this program. Share it with anyone you know, and we look forward to seeing you next time on historyauthortalks.com. Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Thank you, Roger.
Excellent. Well done, sir.